Explanation. Welcome back to Global Current Lens, where headlines are decoded, strategies are exposed, and the truth about global events comes into focus. Opening hook. Welcome back to Global Current Lens, where headlines are decoded, strategies are exposed, and the truth about global events comes into focus. Today, we turn to a striking shift in American public opinion. A clear majority now rejects deploying U.S. troops abroad in the absence of a direct external threat. Explanation. What lies behind this shift? What pressures past and present collide here? Explanation. And how might this stance reshape America's foreign posture or even the global balance of power? Quick context snapshot. In recent polling, some explanation. A majority of Americans have expressed opposition to sending troops overseas unless there is an external threat directly endangering the United States. This sentiment spans both sides of the political aisle, reflecting a growing reluctance toward what many see as perpetual foreign entanglements. Explanation. The debate rages in the halls of Congress, in editorial pages, in think tank forums, and across dinner tables in small-town America. Proponents of restraint see vindication, advocates for global engagement see alarm. The balance of influence in U.S. foreign policy may be shifting. The immediate event in the past month. Explanation. Several major opinion surveys conducted by reputable organizations revealed that more than half of Americans oppose troop deployment abroad without a clear external threat. These findings came amid heightened debate in Washington over possible military commitments in various regions, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and the Indo-Pacific. Explanation. In congressional hearings, lawmakers cited the polls as evidence of shifting public will. Some recent candidate speeches have referenced this aversion to new military missions. Media outlets ran op-eds urging both caution and resolve. Explanation. Citing the need to align foreign policy with voter sentiment. At the same time, defense and foreign policy officials convened closed-door strategy meetings, evaluating scenarios for U.S. force posture and engagement abroad. Some pushed back, warning that public impatience with intervention could undermine deterrence and embolden adversaries. Others welcomed an opportunity for the U.S. to refocus on diplomacy, burden sharing with allies, and investment at home. In short, we are at a moment where policy, public opinion, and strategic deliberation are colliding. The question: will U.S. leadership adjust its approach, or will strategic imperatives override public preference? Upon political context, to understand today's shift, we need to look back. Since World War II, the United States has carried the mantle of global security guarantor. The Cold War era cemented alliances such as NATO. U.S. bases dotted the world. America waged conflicts across continents. The collapse of the Soviet Union did not end U.S. military interventions. It reoriented them toward regional conflicts, humanitarian interventions, counter-terrorism, and stability missions. The 1990s saw interventions in the Balkans and Somalia, sometimes driven by a sense of moral responsibility or humanitarian urgency. Al-Qaeda attacks prompted the war in Afghanistan, followed by the 2003 Iraq invasion. In each case, justifications were layered: self-defense, regional order, democracy promotion. But costs in lives, treasure, and reputation accumulated. As prolonged wars dragged on, public fatigue grew. During the Obama years, we see the strategy of leading from behind, selective engagement, and an emphasis on multilateralism. Under subsequent administrations, debates raged about the U.S. role, whether to act as global policeman or strategic balancer. Wars in Libya, Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere tested both public resolve and institutional endurance. In recent decades, two long wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, have become emblematic of the perils of open-ended missions. Veterans returning, domestic pressures, getting defense and entitlement costs, and the rise of renewed great power competition. China, Russia led many Americans to question whether old models of U.S. intervention still make sense. The idea of deploying troops without existential threat may seem obsolete to a nation more inward-looking, nation grappling with domestic challenges, infrastructure, social cohesion, economic inequality, climate change, polarization, and distrust of elites also color perceptions. Explanation. Some segments see intervention as wasteful or as serving foreign elites rather than American interests. Others view it as necessary but tragically mismanaged. Importantly, the rise of social media and alternative information channels has seeded skepticism, amplified scrutiny of past failures, civilian casualties, explanation, and hidden costs. Politically, both parties have flirted with restraint. Candidates occasionally campaign on pulling back from distant conflicts or imposing red lines. on military engagement. Yet institutional inertia, the military-industrial complex, treaty obligations, alliances, global commitments, resists abrupt change. Explanation, the tension is baked into the structure. Thus, when present polling reveals opposition to troop deployment in non-threat scenarios, explanation, it is not so much a surprise as a turning point. Decades of overextension, costly wars, and shifting priorities have set the stage for a reckoning. The world is watching closely, and responses vary. U.S. allies and partners, many American allies, see this shift with concern. Nations that rely on U.S. security guarantees fear a potential vacuum. In Eastern Europe, countries bordering Russia, particularly in NATO's eastern flank, worry that a less interventionist Washington could weaken deterrence. In East Asia, U.S. treaty partners like Japan, South Korea, and Australia monitor whether Washington will remain committed to forward deployment against Chinese expansion. In the Middle East, states that depend on U.S. security cooperation, such as Israel, Gulf monarchies, and Jordan, may hedge, explanation, seeking alternative partnerships or diversifying their defense strategies. Some allies see an opening. European powers, particularly Germany and France, might push harder to integrate a stronger European security identity, reducing reliance on Washington. Regional powers could assert more influence. Some countries might press the U.S. for assurances or new defense pacts to maintain credibility. Adversaries and challengers, America's rivals, interpret this sentiment as potential strategic opportunity. Russia, for instance, may see reduced U.S. willingness for overseas deployment as easing pressure in their near abroad. Ukraine and beyond, China may read it as a sign of shrinking U.S. interests in Asia, and emboldening territorial claims or influence operations in Southeast Asia, Taiwan, or the South China Sea. Iran might test boundaries in the Gulf region, seeing less risk of robust U.S. intervention. In short, a perceived retreat gives adversaries breathing room. Explanation, neutral non-aligned states for smaller powers and non-aligned states. This shift brings both uncertainty and relief. Some welcome less external pressure and fewer proxy conflicts. Others worry about stability gaps, who will guarantee maritime security, peacekeeping, or crisis intervention. International institutions like the UN and regional bodies like the African Union may see new demands to fill voids. International institutions and NGOs, organizations engaged in conflict resolution, humanitarian relief, and peacebuilding may find both opportunity and challenge. On one hand, reduced U.S. military involvement may lessen civilian harm from large-scale interventions. On the other, funding and logistical capacity that the U.S. frequently provides could diminish, making multilateral operations more difficult. In some U.S. debate over restraint or engagement ripples globally. Allies fret, challengers test limits, and institutions brace for new burdens. Economic and strategic stakes. This shift is not abstract. It carries real costs, risks, and opportunities. Economic stakes, military deployments overseas are expensive. Overseas bases, forward presence, logistics chains with enforced projection incur billions annually. Reducing deployments could free funds for domestic priorities, infrastructure, education, healthcare, resilience. Many Americans cite spend at home first logic when opposing distant missions. But there's a flip side. Industries tied to defense contracting, aerospace, shipbuilding, supply chains could face disruption if force posture is scaled back. Communities economically dependent on military spending may suffer. There is also the strategic cost of power projection. Diplomatic influence, trade routes, stability in critical regions all often depend on credible military presence. If you retreat, you risk losing influence over key choke points. The Persian Gulf, Red Sea, Straits of Hormuz, Southeast Asian sea lanes. Global competitors might fill those gaps, commercially and strategically. So strategic stakes at a strategic level, America's deterrence credibility is at play. If the U.S. signals it will not use force absent direct threats, nation adversaries might test boundaries. This could undermine containment strategies, escalatory deterrence, and alliance assurances. It may make U.S. diplomacy less persuasive in crisis. Conversely, shifting to restraint may sharpen U.S. focus. Resources can go toward modernization, cyberspace, artificial intelligence, advanced conventional deterrence. It may compel Washington to strengthen alliances, burden share, and reinvigorate diplomacy. In effect, U.S. explanation might become leaner but more strategically purposeful. Explanation. There is risk of entrapment, having to respond under pressure when interests become large enough to demand intervention. Abrupt withdrawal might produce instability in regions roiled by conflict, creating refugees, failed states, and power vacuums. Economically, militarized posture might reduce fiscal strain, lowering interest on debt and freeing national will for structural investments. Strategically, it could recalibrate American global leadership, shifting from kinetic dominance to soft power, normative power for nation. An influence built on cooperation and capacity building, but it's a delicate transition done badly. It invites disorder. Done wisely, it could reshape the balance of global order. Possible futures, let us imagine three plausible trajectories from here: de-escalation, limited conflict, escalation, and full escalation. Each path carries risk and opportunities, and the path Washington takes may combine elements of all three. Scenario 1, escalation, restraint, consolidated. In this scenario, U.S. leadership acknowledges popular will and gradually scales back overseas interventions. Force becomes a tool of last resort. The U.S. leans heavily on diplomacy, alliances, economic tools, and soft power instruments. Explanation: Washington renegotiates burdens, sharing with NATO allies, offers more regional security architectures, and empowers local actors. Explanation: defense spending shifts toward modernization and resilience. In regions like the Middle East, the U.S. draws down troops, focuses on counterterrorism via over-the-horizon capabilities, and encourages partner solutions. Global reactions to some allies initially uneasy but adjust. Adversaries test small provocations but find regional powers, local coalitions, or international agencies stepping in. Crises are resolved diplomatically or multilaterally. The U.S. regains moral standing. Domestic criticism remains, was this retreat? But stability holds. Challenges: managing conflicts without boots on ground, preserving deterrence, avoiding perception of weakness. But if well managed, this path aligns strategy with public will while preserving global influence, though in a leaner, less interventionist form. Scenario 2, limited conflict, selective engagement. Here, the U.S. maintains a middle course. It resists open-ended deployments, but under certain conditions, credible threats, allied appeals, humanitarian emergencies, it commits limited forces. Deployments are time-bound, narrowly scoped, supervised by Congress. The Pentagon emphasizes flexibility, special operations drones, and rapid reaction units over heavy ground forces. Washington may refuse mass troop deployments in low-stakes settings, but in hotspots where American interests or allies are directly threatened, it will act. In the Indo-Pacific, the U.S. reinforces presence against China in select areas. In Europe, rotational deployments continue to reassure NATO. In the Middle East, explanation: limited counter-terror missions and maritime security remain. Global reactions: allies feel reassured that the U.S. is not abandoning them entirely. Adversaries operate at the margins but may be deterred in stronger zones. This path offers adaptability, maintaining capacity to act where stakes are high while avoiding overextension. Challenges: deciding when the criteria for deployment are met. Domestic blowback if misjudged, managing expectations from allies, ensuring credibility and partial commitment. In effect, this path becomes the new default engagement, but with constraints and public oversight. Scenario 3, escalation back to heavy engagement. In the third scenario, strategic imperatives or sudden crisis override public sentiment. The U.S. reverts to significant troop deployments abroad, perhaps after a dramatic event, act of aggression, or alliance demand. This resurgence of intervention could be more focused, but with scale. Often when grand strategy or national security feels threatened, public support can shift, rallying around force in moment of crisis. Washington might exploit that to reassert military presence. Under this path, existing commitments expand, new theaters open, global reactions, allies temporarily comforted, adversaries push back hard. They question consistency. Over time, the same cycles of cost, overreach, backlash may reemerge. The risk: repeating the mistakes of prior generations with diminished patience and political capital. Tension peak and big question: we stand at a crossroads. On one path, restraint, aligning U.S. foreign policy with popular will, reducing overseas burdens, focusing on diplomacy and alliances. On another, selective engagement, preserving capacity to act in critical cases. On the third, full re-engagement, reviving the posture of the 20th century, perhaps with fresher tools, explanation, but carrying old dangers. The central question then looms: can the United States recalibrate its global role? preserving deterrence, nation fulfilling alliance commitments and protecting vital interests, without drifting into renewed overextension that public opinion now clearly rejects. Explanation, or to put it more simply, will strategic necessity once again overpower the American public's demand for restraint? As the debate unfolds in Capitol Hill, tanks, and living rooms across America, one thing is certain: U.S. foreign policy is entering a phase of tension between public will and geopolitical reality. Explanation, the outcome will shape not only American power, but the future contours of global order. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you believe that a majority's rejection of troop deployment will decisively curb America's global interventions? Or will strategic imperatives, alliance pressure, and crisis dynamics pull the U.S. back into expansive commitments? Which of the three futures feels most plausible? De-escalation, explanation, limited conflict, or escalation? Drop thoughts in the comments. If you found this analysis valuable, please share, and subscribe. On our next episode, we'll dive into a regional flashpoint and forecast how the U.S., China, and their allies may maneuver. Until then, explanation, this is Global Current Lens, keeping your worldview clear, your questions sharp, and the currents of strategy in focus.